Alright, welcome to RPG Book Club number 57, I think this is. I'm kind of behind on the numbering, so that might not be fully accurate. We have some new people here, so usually when I have time, I record a little video of me going over the rules and giving some feedback as I go, blind, of the book club project winner. It's pretty in-depth, so usually, and slow, so usually the only people that really watch it are the creators of the project, just to get another opinion on it. But, it's there for anyone in case you also want to hear my thoughts or go through the rules at the same time as me. Sometimes I don't zoom in enough for the text to actually be visible on the video quality I have. I've already looked at this a long time ago and given some feedback, so it'll be interesting to dive back in, see what's changed if I can remember any of it. Now, there's a feedback form, apparently, though it is spelled, fill out and feedback form are incorrectly spelled. And there's a Kickstarter page, so definitely check that out if you're thinking about donating. Yeah, so AI Ulmer, I don't know if that is an AI program or that is Al Ulmer or something. That's probably Al Ulmer, but, that's always something people are going to be upset about if they see it, which I know is really stupid considering that might just be this person's name. But, it's something to look out for in the modern landscape. How to play, core mechanic, characters, combat, creating a character. Yeah, off the bat, I'm not really seeing a what this game is section or an introduction per se, but that might just not really be listed. Okay, creating a character, history, talent, features, tags, game master's toolkit, vehicles, NPC dossier. That's interesting. It's not a ton of sections for something that is, up to 93 pages, but maybe that'll work out in its favor, maybe it won't. How to play. What is a role-playing game? Yeah, I'm not going to be reading out much of the text since it's so long. Okay, defining the tone, relatively classic. It's interesting that they went with we, even though I think there was only one person credited as an author. Yeah. This sounds a little too analytical for my taste, but that's a personal preference. So, apparently you can play as villains, which is interesting to note. Yeah, so basically you can subvert the rules if it benefits you, which is, theoretically always true, but it's very nice when the rules affirm that. Okay, this book, other players, set of dice. Okay, 3d6 and 1 should be different. Interesting. That might be a little unnecessary, but I get having it in there. And I'm not even talking about skimming, which is what I'll probably be doing. I just mean in the sense of, some of it's going to kind of be fluff inevitably when you've got like a 90-page book. Okay, 2, 3, and 4. And 7 for your character. So, since that is recommended, that is probably the format I'll be following when I read through this, because I don't usually go through everything for these videos. Okay, don't worry about messing up, that's nice. Session 0, it's not really fully described here, I feel like, but it's good to mention. Have fun. Safety tools mentioned, but not really gone into detail, which is fair. I never really like this rule or the phrasing of it. Like, I get it, but, I just don't think saying they're correct really fits. It's really more just they have the final say even when they're not correct. That's kind of the important part. Yeah, and this sort of implies that you can't even discuss rulings in the moment, which is a relatively restrictive environment. Okay, so it looks like they are trying to really streamline things without much discussion. Or villain, apparently, if the beginning text is correct. Yeah, this is important. Establishing what the campaign is about and everything. Yeah, that's nice. Right, 3 actions during a turn. So, I think already you've kind of got an issue with the, chapter 2, 3, 4, 7 format, and that you're probably going to need these key terms too. Like, assuming they don't specify a lot of this again. Okay. Yeah, so condition is supposed to be a separate item, clearly, I think, but that is not correctly formatted. Okay, reroll any of your dice. You could also see that as being up to all of your dice. Like any one of your dice, if you're only supposed to be reroll one, is how it should be phrased, and specifying that you can do all if you want to is the way it should be phrased in some way, if that is the case, because right now it's ambiguous whether that means you pick one of your dice and reroll, or you can reroll any amount of dice you want. That's kind of ambiguous to me. Okay, given the way doubt works, I'm going to assume that it is one die that you reroll for now. Okay. The GM gets an ego dice for player extreme success, but I don't know if the players get anything for extreme failure yet. So that's a resource of some kind. I can assume that's sort of a passive bonus thing. Okay, so this is the player failure thing I was expecting. And this isn't a spectacular failure, it's just any failure. And you lose all frustration dice when you roll for initiative, so they basically can't be used in combat unless checks occur in combat. Okay. Yep. Looks like it's knocked out, not dead yet. Okay, player characters. Alright. Okay, I was wondering if I should skip ahead at this point, but we'll go on. We've made it through the tombs. Yep. Something. So there's clearly been some Pathfinder inspiration. I think that was explicitly mentioned somewhere, maybe, like in some of the promotional materials, but I could be wrong. It was something I already knew from previous feedback I've given. And I will note that something I hate about the way Pathfinder works is tags. Like, for example, there's this incapacitate tag, and you would think that's just to indicate, I don't know if that's the right term per se, and you would think that's just to indicate to you that a spell can incapacitate, but it actually means that, you know, enemies have there's a special rule you add that gives enemies an increased chance of success at succeeding the saving throw, and that's nowhere in the body text of the rule, and that's an example of how I think tags don't work in Pathfinder, where sometimes they basically just add rules, and you have to know the system well enough to figure that out, or go back and reference it each time, or you're using the ability wrong. And to me, that's not a great way to have a tag system, but we'll see if this game also follows through on that. Okay, the abilities heroes possess. Okay, this is talking about things that are passive. So, figuring out the difference between a talent and a feature may just be the amount of significance they have, but we'll have to see. Okay, there are talent sets. Yeah. Standard DC kind of thing. Alright. So kind of like levels, I'm guessing, and it goes 1 to 5. Alright. Typically 1 turn per round, which I would have expected. It's interesting that it can be more than that. This section, I'm going to say, is extremely unlikely to be accurate. I'm sure there are more rules that you need to know than making a check to actually play this game on any significant level. I mean, you can play a game just knowing how checks work, but it very much would not be this game. Certain. Yep, make a check. Get roll 3d6, apply bonuses and penalties from attribute score, features, talent, any other sources. Compare the total to the TC. Now, that implies to me that confidence and doubt are themselves considered bonuses and penalties because they are not separately mentioned. And the same would have to go with the potential of using a frustration die if that is something that can interact with a check. Even though that, I would have to say, is definitively a separate step. The same with doubt and confidence, because unlike, say, D&D, they do not apply automatically. You have to actively choose to apply confidence and doubt, it looks like. The same with frustration die. So there should be a step in here about choosing to apply certain bonuses. Okay. Not clear just from this why 1d6 has to be different yet. It should be different. Compared to the total to the TC, yep. Lower than the TC, higher than TC success, lower than TC it's failure, and there are 3 degrees of each. Interesting. Alright, so perfect failure only occurs, a critical fail, let's say, only occurs if the value would, fail the check anyway, which is different than certain systems. Okay, 6 or more lower than the TC. Get 1 frustration. Now let me look at this. Okay, so right here, we so far have no description of what a success or failure actually is, which is something important to have as a baseline. Maybe they will explain more later, because, if I just read this, all I know is a spectacular failure is that they gain 1 frustration from it. I don't even technically know that they do not succeed at the action they are taking. And furthermore, I do not know if there will be any downside other than that, other than not succeeding at the action they are taking, which is important to establish with failures. I'm seeing if it is established here. Okay, and then there should be TC someone in here. Yeah, it never says baseline what a success and a failure are, which is something you can assume would be obvious, but it means different things in different systems, especially when you're going to have tiers of success and failure. The more rules you add without specifying the baseline, the more it makes it seem like that baseline doesn't exist and it's only what's established in the rules. And like I said, every system does success and failure differently, so it's important to know how this system defines it. Yeah, even in baseline failure. Okay, so get a spectacular failure versus get a failure, but even in the section that is spectacular failure, what a spectacular failure is that you get is not described. I'm guessing a lot of these things, anytime you make a specific check or a saving throw, it's going to tell you what the effect of various kinds of failures have, but it appears in this system you still make general checks to try to do things, and for that, not only do you need to describe what a failure looks like, whether it is just the action does not complete, or there can be an additional consequence, depending on context, you also need to establish how how getting a spectacular failure differs from getting a failure. And even if it's defined later, it really should be defined under the spectacular failure heading. Like, you're sort of defining a term with itself. The definition of spectacular failure is you get a spectacular failure. Okay. Let's see here. Right, in any kind of failure, you get a frustration, but a normal success does not give the gem ego. Okay, different kinds of checks. Only one action is required. It will be listed as a quick check. Okay, versus an extended. Yeah, and if it requires more actions than you have, you can't use it. Yep. Yeah, so I was hoping we would get maybe that the reason there is not a general case for success and failure is that it is very different based on each type, but they're still not really telling us what an action check failure is, so that's not the case. Okay, one of your 3d6 is a damage dice. Okay, and the different die that you have is supposed to be the damage die. Interesting. Okay, so this establishes that attacks are checks. But, I would expect to have, if you're having all of these different full categories, you would be describing what a check actually looks like for that action or that category. It's more like with this, you're just establishing the different kind of things that trigger checks, and there could be a different, that could just be you have to make a check for doing an action or an attack or blah blah blah, because there's not anything about checks per se in each of these descriptions so far. Basic checks. A basic check is a check which doesn't require any action to perform. Okay, any activity listed under check is basic. That's sort of the basic roleplay story kind of check, and as I've said, it does not appear to be defined what a success versus a failure is. For my opinion, if flat is a term that can be applied to any check to modify it, it shouldn't be considered one of these categories, because it exists within each of these categories potentially. It's more like a tag or a modifier. Okay, yeah, so this establishes that there are negative consequences if they fail, and one could assume based on that, not being in any other descriptor, that that is the only time a failure has a negative consequence. That's why it's important to establish these things. Saving throw is basic saving throw. Okay, take damage for failing. Okay, interesting. So far, we're not seeing a lot of differentiation between spectacular and perfect success and failure, but we'll see. If it's a very niche thing, potentially the system should be simplified by just only having one super success and super failure state. Static TC, it is written check type attribute score used. Okay, so that would be, say, attack, action, basic, blah blah blah, and then say grit, if that's the attribute. So it would be an attack grit check if you were making an attack and it used the grit attribute. And then later so it's like attack grit against 15, potentially. Action strength check against DC 15, yep. Okay, this might be formatted wrong. It is written, whatever that is, like half quote, then followed by a parenthesis and attribute score used, even though attribute score used shows up later. I think this is just not supposed to be there, so I'm going to ignore it. It's written check type against the attribute score used, defense of the target. Okay. Alright. I wonder if it being against the defense of a character is consistent for every kind of attack. I feel like if it was, that should be noted or something. And maybe there's a way things could be simplified. Target checks. Alright, so tier 1 is already 21, right? Oh, okay, no, taking the character's tier and adding 10 to it, and then they have a table to show that. Alright, that's better. And relatively low checks compared to, say, Pathfinder. Yep, shoot. I don't know about that. Sometimes certain circumstances can make a character's success seem higher or lower. Okay. So confidence and doubt, but that's due to circumstances versus factors. Like the difference is player side versus, enemy side to an extent. But I feel like there should be more delineation between what factors make a TC harder and the circumstances that make a character's success seem less likely. How is that different between circumstances that make a situation harder? That should be specified. Okay. Yeah, can reroll any dice they have. That's a little more explicit than it can be all dice, but I feel it's kinda ambiguous still, just slightly. And I don't like having a, bolded heading sort of thing saying confidence. Okay, never mind, that does define confidence. Alright, that was a mistake on my part. Okay, confidence can stack. I'm not sure why the one die at a time thing there is necessary when it's not there for normal confidence. The opposite of having confidence is having doubt. Yep. Yeah, this is definitely phrased wrong. Yeah, you just copied the text for confidence here and changed it slightly, but that doesn't work. It should be when they roll with multiple instances of doubt, they re-roll the highest die and then re-roll whatever the highest die is after that, which may be the same or a different die, and they do that a number of times equal to the doubt score, which this paragraph doesn't really indicate. Yeah, it's good that those cancel each other out, otherwise it would be a nightmare to configure. It does seem like confidence gives you way more of a benefit than doubt gives you a disadvantage, though, it's worth noting. Okay, always round down, which a lot of systems that say always round down ignore the case of getting 0 for a result and what that would mean. So I'll have to watch out for that, because if you're rounding down, you can get 0 in a lot of systems, and sometimes that messes with stuff. Okay, characters. This section talks through the important aspects of a character, and that's chapter 3, so we're still reading it. Fit. Okay, flavor stuff, sort of. It's good to go over these things because there are so many systems that just forget to. But so far it's all details, personal beliefs, very nice. Because like all this other stuff, while stuff like persona and name are cool, they don't really speak to the full personality of the character necessarily, but this does. Biography, life of a character up till now. So I guess that sort of backstory, I'd like more detail on that. And how much you're supposed to fill out for it and such. But this really, I feel like, is good coverage for talking about how you would make a character actually a character. And there are so many systems that I see miss that. They just sort of either have nothing at all that really speaks to the non-mechanical aspects of a character, or they have ancillary details like persona and name and maybe ties or something that doesn't feel like it comes together to make a full character. Whereas with, beliefs, name and persona, and backstory or biography, that feels like it really gives coverage for a character. I do feel like you need a bit more descriptor on biography, though, if that never comes up. Okay, attribute scores. 0. Okay, that sort of confuses me. I don't know what that means precisely. So -4 on any stat would kill you? It seems like that implies. Are you saying the average score of all the attributes on a human, not the average score of each? Okay, it does look like each attribute, if we're talking minimum of -4 and maximum of +3, but I'll have to see if having an attribute that low can really kill you. Character's nexus score can never be below 0. Alright. Health. Multiply tenacity by 30. Okay, so that we've moved on from attributes, I think. And so they're dealing with the case of 0, at least for this. We'll see if that continues on checks and things. The things we actually have to round. Should N. Okay, it's also a health and a resource you can spend. And that's grit by 30. So it's grit and tenacity. that determines the healths. Okay, attribute 4 plus 5. Rewards by tier. 5 attribute points, 5 talents, and 2 features. The maximum attribute score is 4. At this point, this does not really tell me how you get negatives, but we'll have to see. Maybe you can put -1 in one category to gain an additional attribute point or something. But I'm just guessing how this goes based on this table. I don't really technically know what attributes are at this point. Strength, okay. Since gamma between tiers 1 and 5. Okay, street is level most regular humans are at. Yeah, that seems a little exaggerated for being the level most humans are at. Okay, peak of humanity. Okay, and squads of thugs. So the improvement here seems relatively mild, right? The thing that improves is... Okay, so I'm guessing these are cumulative, in which case the main thing that improves is you just double the amount of attributes, talents, and features you have. That should not, just a doubling, should not involve being, I guess, city level. Like, the description seems kind of fine. Like, squads of thugs just by doubling off of this. You could already fight a few thugs, so going from a few to a squad in a doubling doesn't seem odd. However, the term being city is maybe a lot, going from street to city for just, if we're using the way those terms are normally used in terms of power scaling, is a lot for just doubling a baseline. Platoons of soldiers. And now we might be getting to a little too much, because at this point, you just have basically 3 times the benefits of a street-level person, and you can already go to platoons of soldiers. We'll have to see if that really works gameplay-wise, though that would be sort of difficult to determine. Planetary. Yeah, entire alien armies, and single-handedly win a war. Like, we are sort of exponentially increasing the feats, but increasing the benefits by a static rate. As a result of that, these are a little overblown, I feel. Yeah, like, that seems, again, a little unlikely. Not that this didn't. Okay, there we go. The character's tier is also used to determine the damage multiplier. That's how it can have effect. But if the tier is just you add that tier to the damage multiplier, it's definitely not that much of an improvement either, even though it might be more significant than some of the other changes. Okay. Yep. Yeah, it looks like technically it might not have been necessary to read the defining terms at the beginning, because they all tend to be defined over again here, which can still work in a rulebook because you want an area to reference all the terms used, even if they're explained in other places still. Okay, 1 frustration to gain confidence, but it has to be before a check. Okay, just regain health. Might be very difficult to knock characters down this way, because they get frustration every time they miss an attack. Okay, interesting. and you gain less energy than health, which does seem to imply energy is more important than health, which makes sense as energy is a resource as well as a health measure, whereas health is just health. But it takes the same amount of buy-in to get, both of them are just a stat multiplied by 30 to determine their value, which does seem to imply that they should be equivalent rather than one being better than the other. Okay. Alright. So the GM can spend ego dice, or supervillains can use the ego dice. I don't know whether that means what that means per se, but I'm guessing that means, I just don't know what that means. What the difference is between the GM spending it and the character spending it. Or does that mean player characters can, if they are supervillains? I don't know. But you can only use up to 3 per round as a character specifically. But you can store up as much of it as you want, it seems like. Spending ego. All characters can spend ego in 3 ways. That is probably a mistake or a typo, I would think. Because it just said supervillains can use ego. Yeah, because PCs aren't even supposed to get them at all, so all characters might be the wrong term there. Yeah, I think it's another case of they just copied all characters because they were copying text, but they forgot to change aspects of it because some of the text was redundant, but not all of it. So that's another error. For another character rolls a check, the villain can spend 1 ego to give the character a doubt on that check. Okay, so it is the villain spending it in this list, not the GM, question mark? Okay, this is sort of like a legendary action, interesting. I wonder if they can do multiple actions, like spend this multiple times for the same character's turn end. It's not really specified. I know they could only do it up to 3, but could they all do it on the same turn, or same end of turn? But so far, these are all ways that the villain, the supervillain, can spend ego, not that the GM can independently, which makes this text still kind of confusing. Maybe there will be ways the GM can use it later on, maybe not. Like, I'm only saying there's differentiation here because an ego dice, GM gains ego dice. They can be spent in a variety of ways. Additionally, supervillains can use them, which makes it sound like, the GM can use them outside of for a supervillain, but that's not really established anywhere else. Okay. Yep, initiative, already covered that. Characters have a walk speed, climb speed, jump speed, and swim speed. Doesn't really say how to calculate those, but okay, no differentiation for diagonal movement so far. Or maybe you're supposed to be saying they can only do it to adjacent spaces, not diagonally. Five for normal walk speed, at least, not for the swimming or climbing, as far as we know. For every 5 points in a character's reflexes score, increase their base walk speed by 1, okay. And size changes it. Okay, and then those are all half. So you can have 0 for some of these speeds if you managed to get less than 5 walk speed, but I'm not sure that would even be possible. Oh, okay. Parentheses rounding up, and whereas before it said you always round down. Okay, let me look back at rounding. I'll just look it up. Makes things easier. Okay. So this says anytime you round down, even though otherwise you round up. And that's not necessarily a problem because specific beating general is a relatively standard thing. But it's also worth noting that as far as I know, this rulebook does not establish that specific beats general anywhere, even though a lot of them do, despite it being an assumption. Yeah, okay, there we go. Back to where we were. Okay, modified speed and base speed are different. Modifiers by scale. Okay, we'll look straight at human for now. There's no modifier, that's all the way things normally go. Okay, and then, yeah, so size modifies a lot, which is interesting. I guess size increasing speed makes sense because it would be based on stride and stuff. It's interesting that it doesn't seem to directly scale with the width of the creature, though. Like, this has double the width and its speed is doubled, but this has 5 times the width and it's only tripled, which makes sense because bigger things tend to be slower relative to their speed, to their size, I mean, at least in terms of fantasy and stuff. Is there a damage modifier? Okay, there's a damage bonus. How many squares along the longest side? That's a little confusing because it doesn't say anything about the shortest side. And thinking about it, width would probably determine scale in a sense, not the other way around. Then that's not really that important. Weight's relative to size. Okay. Let me look back at that. Is weight how much weight they can lift then? Or, this is kind of confusing. Because weight is relative to the creature trying to pick up the thing, not to the creature's size itself, maybe. Like, weight is apparently more about difference in scale between two different things, and yet there seems to be a flat weight per scale, so I don't know how that's supposed to work out. Is it just saying that, like, here, yes, yeah, so the scale is 2, but the weight is NA, so that's definitely not about a difference, even though a difference in scale is what determines the weight, not the scale itself. Maybe you meant to say what weight they can lift, but it just says the weight itself is relative to things. It's very confusing there. Like if the object is scale 9, it has 2 weight, and yet for 9 we see the weight is supposed to be like 12, and if you're just thinking about difference, if we go to a difference of 0, which has been the same, the weight is just an A. Even though for weights the same of two relative things, the weight is 2 for when they have the same scale, it's confusing. Damage bonus. Okay, defense bonus. Okay, and it's specifically strength and reflex defense scores that it affects. Okay, I'm just gonna ignore that because that's something that's a niche thing. Okay, it's very nice that this is fully filled out, I guess, but when we're looking at history, that's how that reflects biography is a little more complicated, I suppose. Yeah, I don't know what this history category is supposed to represent. Is this part of character creation? Is it what exactly is history? Okay. So something to watch for about this is a character may, in a sense, be at their most powerful at level 1 because they get all of this stuff at the same time as they get stuff from their source, I'm guessing. And when they level up, they get all of this stuff again, not additional stuff from their source, as far as I can tell. So that again makes this progression scale questionable in application. Yeah, so the talents have to be purchased, but I'm guessing the source gives you access to be able to purchase them. We'll have to see if that's specified, though. Oh, and you can get additional sources from certain effects. Training comes in packages. Probably gonna have to look back at what packages means again. But honestly, I don't think it was ever defined to a point for me to understand it, so I'm gonna have to hope that just gets there later. Effects can give a character additional training, sure. Character weakness to certain types of radiation. General features. Mechanical effects. And tags have non-mechanical, that's good to know. Alright, I'm gonna go back to the beginning to see what I'm supposed to look at, and as long as I'm doing that, there are other things I can look up. Yeah, okay, you are supposed to read 4, then move on to 7. Let's look at these. Where's package, assuming it comes up? I thought package was defined here, but I'm not seeing it. Okay, I'll just ignore that for now. Maybe relook up packages later. Alright, combat is important. Majority of the time. Okay, I'm probably gonna skip this because I'm getting a little tired. And this, yeah, those will probably be relatively standard. Okay, confirm positions, roll initiative, start a new round. Each character takes their turn. Okay. So it looks like people can surrender, but that only qualifies at the end of the round, sort of. Combat can't end before the round ends. Through surrender, at least. Though I suppose people can still choose to do nothing on their turns. Beginning of new combat is rolling initiative. Okay, and they do establish that this is not just picking wherever you want, it's the location where the character was. And GM has the final say, both good things to establish. Okay, roll for NPCs all at once. Tie NPCs act first. Okay. And then PCs decide. Okay. Relatively simple. Maybe more complicated than it needs to be, but the complicated bits are things you can just ignore, and most people would be comfortable with ignoring. Like, it's mostly around how to resolve ties, and people will just come up with their own way of doing that if they think it's too complicated. Okay, one reaction and three reactions at their turn. The way you're saying this, that they gain them, is an interesting way of doing it, but unless you say they lose them later, that implies that you can just store up actions and reactions. Okay. Yep. Okay. Okay, interrupts the triggering event usually, which is good to know. Yep. It's interesting that they must have one action or reaction remaining. I'm guessing that just means once all resources are spent, their turn automatically ends. But no, that doesn't cover reaction. So, I don't know the reason for that specifically, but it's fair, I suppose. Wait. Okay, so free actions have requirements and triggers, and ones with requirements you need stuff remaining, but ones with triggers you don't. That's maybe a little overcomplicated. Okay, preparing an action, 2 actions, state a trigger, and then use the quick action. But it burns a reaction, so you have to spend 2 actions and a reaction to use a held action. That seems similar to Pathfinder, if I remember right. And this also seems Pathfinder-y, if I remember. But I believe you had to spend at least 1 action for that in Pathfinder. I can't quite remember. Okay, so that seems very lenient, and it's interesting to see how that would end up. I think it's a fun system to have. I've never quite seen holding your turn not cost anything, and it'd be interesting to see how that plays out. Universal actions. Okay. I don't know if I'm going to read all of these. I'm just going to scan the headings for a bit to see how far this goes on before I commit. Okay. I'm going to try to scan them because there's not too many. Help. I'm just gonna ignore help because it seems very complicated. Prone on the ground at walk speed at least 1. Okay, you can only move one square while prone, basically. Alright, getting back to this now. Just looking over some of these. It's nice that retrieving and using an item can be the same action. It's interesting, it doesn't really say what happens if there is nothing hidden in the environment for notice. Yep. It's also fairly consistent with Pathfinder. The spectacular success effect of that is fun, reminds me of Breath of the Wild. It's interesting that that requires no check. Suppose the enemy would be doing spot hidden to find you if you're not directly in their line of sight. Yeah, it is a little confusing how that would work. Because you're supposed to find hidden things in your line of sight, hidden things or characters, but sneak ends as soon. Oh, I guess there's also cover. And maybe it's not the same for them entering close enough for you to be in their line of sight. It's only if you end an action there. I don't know. You could also start the sneak in line of sight, which is interesting. I don't necessarily dislike that. That's like Pathfinder, but I feel like the scaling is slightly different. Could be wrong though. there's no table below in this case, but oops. Is just normal movement covered here at all? Okay, it is, but it's not in the movement section for some reason. Oops, alright. So here horizontal equals the glide speed and vertical is half of it. Whereas here vertical is glide speed and horizontal is double it. I don't know what makes that a glide precisely. It seems like they can just choose to move faster if they want to, but it's not clear if that has an additional action cost or why it would be a dive per se. Okay. That would make it really easy to travel places very far with a rope in one action potentially. Because it doesn't say the line has to already be anchored, just that there's an anchor within the reach of the line. But maybe that's a misphrase. It's interesting that you can jump horizontally half the distance you can walk. That's fairly generous. Let me go back to move, because I don't think I was questioning earlier. Yeah, whether diagonal movement was covered, and it's not really. I'm assuming you can only move horizontally space to space, and vertically space to space effectively. Okay. Yep. There's a lot of info here under lifting and carrying, and it might have some answer some of my questions about weight that I had earlier, but I don't think I'm that interested in reading it. There are other things I'd want to focus on. Maybe I'll give it a once over again. Ah. Yeah, you don't need to say for every step larger if it's 3 multiplied by the difference, unless you mean, because that kind of makes it sound like, say for an object that was 1 weight higher, it would be 5, but then for an object that was 2 weight higher, it would be 11. You know, if it's both increasing, multiplied by the difference and increasing by that multiple each step of the distance, that might be more of a change than you meant by writing that. Okay. I would guess they can't throw it either, but perhaps not. Okay. Okay. That last sentence confused me for a second, but I think I get it. Yeah, so is it certain environments allow a character to gain an advantage from being higher than another? Or is it certain environments allow a character to be higher than another and thereby gain an advantage? Because it's not really clear whether this being a square higher is always relevant or is only relevant in an area that is considered high ground. Number of scores they fell, interesting. Okay. Oh no, it's multiplied by the character's tier. Let me go back and see if that was clear earlier. Damage multiplier. I suppose that should have been obvious that that was multiplication, but I'm so used to modifier, I just kind of counted it as that. That does give a significant bonus to damage at higher tiers. Okay. This is interesting. Huh. So, do you not roll for damage separately then? Is it just one of the 3 die that went with the check is the damage die? I can see why you would need a separate die for that, but it also kind of seems like having that extra die for that might be a little unnecessary, but it's interesting. And since I think to get a perfect anyway, you have to roll 6 3 times, I'd have to go back and double check that. That would end up being 18 damage times multiplier plus attribute, so that would be a lot of damage. It's not really thematic then, I feel like, but it's good to know. Okay. So, damage type is decided by GM, it looks like. Below 0, however, energy can. Yep. Okay, that's very interesting. Hmm. So it kind of seems like getting your energy reduced doesn't really matter except for losing resources until, it goes into that negative range far enough. There's also no way to directly knock someone unconscious by doing energy damage, it looks like. Okay, it's very important to note. I'm still not sure if you can ever really fully die based on that. Okay. Yeah, I get that. So it's funny because in a lot of ways it seems like reviving someone who is unconscious is harder than reviving someone who is dead, but it doesn't take the frustration die resource, so it's hard to say how that would go. And it doesn't even see it takes any actions from the adjacent character. Maybe that's covered in universal actions, but I don't think it is. Okay, heroes are always assumed to be pulling their punches, is interesting. That's kind of cool. It's fun to be able to knock people through things. So it's one of the few things that I feel like really gives that sort of wacky superhero theming it seems like this is sometimes going for. Okay, so you can't fully heal by sleeping, it looks like, but because it's, tenacity times 30 to determine health, and the highest you can get is tenacity times 20. But it does go relatively fast. Actually, perhaps not, now that I'm thinking about it. For some reason, I was adding 10 there, or times 10 in there. Okay, so it's by every hour, I'm guessing. So say if you slept for 8 hours, that would be 16 times your tenacity. So about half of your full tenacity if you slept for 8 hours. And you can do it faster if you use frustrations. Interesting. I guess you could do that in combat, right? No, because it's 1 minute. Okay, that's very generous that ammunition is not tracked and reloading doesn't take an action. Okay. So technically speaking, for still going inside the range, but only just inside the range, by going to 40 you would get a doubt. But it's a pretty long range, so that probably shouldn't be that significant. I wonder what cone means in the context of the type of damage it does. I guess you would assume it's still ranged. Okay, bows don't get special abilities for some reason. Okay, so that's effectively a finesse weapon, though I don't think the description for it is that well, and I probably wouldn't understand it if I didn't know what finesse weapons were. So the damage multiplier is not the damage modifier, which means the damage multiplier is just their tier, right? I think that's how that works. Okay, so this says reach. Do all melee weapons have reach in parentheses? Because this one gets extra range, and it says reach, but this also says reach. And I guess just by them being melee, you assume their range is 5 feet, unless they have something like it gains +1 square. I'm not seeing anything like laser rifle or anything like that, which you would expect in a superhero thing. However, that might be, part of special abilities and stuff. Conditions. I'm probably not going to look at most of these. Yeah, that's a decent thing for invisible, I feel like. Okay, does that mean you can't be attacked, though? Or at least can't be attacked with physical things? I guess. Okay, I do want stunned and stupefied, because that's part of the energy mechanics. And prone, because that's a important mechanic. That seems relatively standard for prone. I think this would also prevent you from taking mental actions. And maybe a lot of those require these kinds of stats as checks, but also maybe not. So there might still be things that you can do if you're stunned and stupefied. Which calls into question how effective, along with other things, how effective being knocked out on energy actually is. Okay, this is an interesting way of doing things. sort of like targets you can see in D&D, except universal, and more than just seeing them, you need to be able to reach them uninterrupted with something. Yeah, that is very confusing to me, that phrasing. I don't quite know what that means. Okay, perhaps never mind then. It isn't really universal at all either. So, like, this is very ambiguous. It's not clear if you need two line of effects, one for throwing the grenade and another for the grenade's explosions, or if you no longer need a line of effect to throw the grenade. I think it's plausible that there are some sort of throwing rules that cover their own line of effect thing, so ignoring the grenade effect example for a second, if someone, say, created a fireball, assuming they can do that, they might be able to do it completely behind a wall as long as the epicenter of the explosion and the enemy have an uninterrupted line of effect, and the character and the point the fireball starts at do not have to have a uninterrupted line of effect. If it needs that, it seems like that's not specified because they use okay, it doesn't say instead here, but it does say the effect's origin, and based on the grenade example, you'd expect some kind of explosion power to be the origin of that effect to be the epicenter, but maybe I'm wrong. I feel like that's all fairly ambiguous. Okay. Oops. Oops. That's all interesting. This is probably just the same as Pathfinder. But perhaps not, because I don't think, I don't think Pathfinder does circles like this. It looks like they're sort of not doing any diagonal rules for having the amount a range can travel diagonally be different than horizontally or vertically. And maybe that also applies to movement, but at this point I don't even know if you can move diagonally still. So the question is, why would you ever not be sneaking, given that it does not require a check of any sort, or it does not seem to? Because, like, that is the same thing for the other actions, for the other sneak action. I'm not going to go all the way back to look, though. Oops. First time a character attacks with an object, they gain a bonus on the attack check equal to the object's attack modifier. Well, only the first time. Okay, to the object's attack modifier, and yet the object is being treated as the weapon it is closest to, but also it has this object modifier as well for some reason, as well as the normal modifier for that weapon, I think. It's kind of funny that an armored building only gives you a +4 modifier to damage. Alright, on to creating characters. Okay. Yeah, that's pretty good. They do talk about actually having a backstory and things effectively. Okay. It looks like this was sort of designed with party members having different tiers potentially in mind. Okay, so if you consider tier to be an equivalent to level, it sometimes doesn't ever increase. Okay, sub-tiers, interesting. Let me just double check something for a second. Let's go back to basic actions. To attack. Basic attack. Yeah, I would say you need a description of how to calculate damage and everything here as well. I didn't even realize that the damage die doesn't, like, that no die gets re-rolled. And damage and chance to hit are not actually calculated separately at all. Under normal circumstances, anyway. It also doesn't talk about the tier modifier here, and that's an important thing to establish very clearly. Okay, I think we're like on 30. Okay. That's that. Yeah, I'd also have maybe have a multiplier column here, even though, it is just the same as tier. Okay. Now, it is worth noting that it really doesn't say here that you spend attribute points to, increase these. And I get that you would think that that would be obvious, but it's good to establish anyway, I think. And maybe it will be later down the line. Okay. The starting score for everything is 0. I was questioning earlier in the beginning it made it seem like there was a way to get minuses as a PC, but it doesn't look like that's something that happens often. To increase, you can spend attribute points gained from increasing interior on a one-to-one basis. Okay, that establishes how points are spent. That's good. Okay, and then this is something I theorized would be the case, and it turned out is. And you don't really mess with the nexus for this. I'm just thinking, so based on the way the tier multiplier works, a bonus of damage of a minimum of 3 is applied for each tier you are, because that's the lowest you can roll, and you roll more based on what tier you're at. And so to get a comparable benefit from attributes, you have to really plug in a lot, and that might end up leading to a feeling of attributes and how you score them not really mattering that much, because what the tier actually is, it outstrips their effect so easily, potentially, but that's just a theory. And obviously attributes do more than just apply to damage, so... Now this is very odd. Nexus score is the maximum number of frustration dice you can, yet you gain that maximum at the start of each combat, and yet in other sections it feels the need to specify that you lose all frustration die when initiative is rolled. So that all very much confuses me. Like, it would have been better early on to just say your, frustration die amount is reset to maximum when you enter combat, not just saying that they all go away and not stating that the max comes back until way later in the book. I don't agree with that method of explaining. Yeah, if an attribute applies to luck even, it does make me curious what kind of checks don't have anything applied to them, because that was specified as something that happens. Okay, that's about what I expected. That's very interesting. So say Batman's origin would be not his parents dying, but him deciding to fight crime and learning how, and then his training would be something else entirely than the training he did to become a hero. That's maybe a little bit confusing in terms of term. Trying to think for a second whether it would be better to switch the terms for these. because their training is the stuff they learned outside of being a hero. But I guess there are plenty of origins that, training wouldn't look for. So. Okay, that is good to know. Okay, so you can spend those on attributes, but you can't spend attribute points on talents. Good to know. Yeah, and it doesn't really explain how much talents cost. It just says it'll talk about that later, other than unlocking the talent tree in the first place. Which is fair enough, I suppose. As long as you say when you're going to talk about it, and you actually follow through on that. Oops. Yeah, also character creation is such a short section. I'm surprised it wasn't included in, the things you need to read. It's only like 3 pages. There's a few things I want to revisit now that we've gone through that. I think it's fair to have this character explanation segment before character creation. Now I just want to make sure that everything is sort of explained in the character creation stuff. Yeah, not all of this. Like, you would think some of these details would be in character creation, like stuff like this. I don't think should be in the general overview. They should be in the actual nitty-gritty of how you do it in character creation. But maybe that's more of a personal thing. Okay, yep. Stats. So, like, a lot of this, the character creation isn't that specific about. Or maybe that's details and I just didn't notice. You fill in the attributes, you talk about history, you decide the tier. Those are mechanics, effectively. Initiative, speed, those are the extra details you fill in, I'm guessing. Scale isn't really covered in character creation, I don't think, but I assume it defaults at 6. Let's see, history. Origin, training. Well, this is source, and this is training, and later it says origin and training. So that's an inconsistency, I think. Yeah, I wanted to see how they do the details, though. Yeah, and the persona, name, those aren't part of the fill out the details officially. So that's missing on character creation. I also would think you would have the specifics on the actual step-by-step process of creating the character, and in the overview you would just mention, if you weren't going to explain it both times, you would just mention what health is, but you'd want how to actually calculate it, if not being in both areas, then being exclusively in the character creation area, because that's where you're going to actually need to know that when you're creating your character. Okay, there we go. That covers it. Alright, so everything is kind of covered, at least in a general sense, but I do think there's a small issue where some of the things that should be more specific in the step-by-step character creation section are not. But it looks like all the little aspects of the character are covered. It's nice that this is being covered. Here we're using source again. Okay, so it was just on me for not for thinking that origin was the title when it's always been source. I kind of just assumed on that. That's the word that jumped out at me when I was looking on this paragraph, but it is consistently source in training, not origin in training. Origin is just mentioned when describing the source, which isn't a problem. It just confused me a little. Right. Alien parentage. And what you get from this is tags, which I don't know if the tags are just flavor, if I recall, and the universal speech actually does this. You don't get anything out of the alien parentage category, it looks like, except universal speech. You don't unlock like a tree or anything, which is a little odd, unless there's explicitly is an alien rather than alien parentage sections. This is very much not in line with the Superman trope, and that the alien parentage only gives you universal speech. But like I said, there might be a separate category for actual alien. Okay, amphibious look different. Swim 1. Yep. Features tech reliant and artificial mind. Supernatural senses. Transformation sequence. Maybe I'm not understanding the features correctly. Let me look. Okay, talent set. I was assuming like Swim 1 and stuff would be part of a talent set, but maybe not. I wonder if your source actually gets you that much. Oops. Okay, technically speaking, I don't even need to look at these. I just need to skip to 7, so I guess I'll do that. Talents. So this was history. Which of these are origins and which of these are sources and which of these are trainings? Because we just have history here. Okay, here's the sources. And then here's the training. Alright, that's how it's separated. Yeah, it looks like some of these don't give you tags, unlike the sources, which all seemed to, unless I was wrong. And some of these don't have tags, okay. And it looks like these things are sort of equivalent in what they offer you, except they don't change your appearance as much and stuff or anything like that. Okay, let's look at talents. Okay, so there are prerequisites, they just aren't mentioned, and those may apply to sources. They are just not mentioned in the sources themselves. Okay, so health can be spent as a resource. I would have liked that mentioned earlier. Okay. Yep. So it's interesting that the individual talents within a set appear to be what have prerequisites rather than the set itself, which is not what I would have expected. Okay, requirement tier 1, duration permanent. What I want to look at mostly is prerequisites and stuff, and then I'll probably only look at the ones I'm going to look at here based on a character I create, in a sense, because that's an easier way, I feel like, to get a good smattering of an in-depth look at some of the skills rather than trying to look at all of them shallowly. Can climb speed. Okay, you get an adapted body, and that isn't really tied to any source. That's cool. This is another thing that I think really fits the theming. When targeted for attacks, you can use empathy in place of acuity. I assume that would be for ones that, normally would do acuity and not all attacks. So I'm guessing this is the thing where you can just use talent points to increase an attribute instead, but they list them as an actual talent, which is sort of odd. Like, I would think that could just be covered by your acuity goes up by 1, even if you were going to have it in this list. I see, this is why. Like, these are different in that they are tied to the tier you require, where earlier it said you can just increase things differently. Let me go back. Yeah, so this makes it sound like you can just get however many activity attribute points you want on a one-to-one basis, but later it looks like it requires you to be certain tiers to add certain amounts. So that's a inconsistency, I would say. Okay, external appendages, and you can flavor these to fit your thing. Okay, fly. You just get these automatically. Are these the talent sets? I assumed they wouldn't be because they're core talents. Let me keep going to find out. And did these all cost 1? I wasn't really clear on that. That's never been established, I don't think. I'll have to go back. Right now, I'm just trying to see where the talent... Okay, so there's agent. So I'm guessing that's the first sort of set. Okay. Actions extended parentheses 10. I do not know what that means. I'll have to go back and look, because I think you still only get 3 actions with a turn. And it says something you don't have the remaining number of actions to do on a turn you cannot do. It says that earlier in the action segment, and yet this takes 10 actions. It says extended, but that just means it takes more than one action. And you need silent takedown with this. Is that a feature? No, it is a talent. And it doesn't look like any sources are a prerequisite so far. Okay, that is interesting. I think that means... No, I do get it. I just don't feel like explaining it. Yeah. Okay, this all seems cool. Something that bothers me that I thought was the case, you know, for... Yeah, I feel like versions of this in the past had things tied to source in a way that they aren't now. And I preferred it that way because it made the source seem to matter more. And I looked back at some of my old feedback on this just to make sure, you know, I knew what I was talking about in regards to that. It looks like how to do actions that would take multiple turns was supposed to be added in the next issue, but I haven't seen it if it has been. Sources were never tied to talents, even though I thought they were. So that's, yeah, that's definitely consistent. Yeah, I think personally for me, I dislike that a bit, but, you know, that's always going to be up to personal interpretation. What was the last thing I was going to say? Oh yeah, I made a mistake earlier when I said the tier system being a multiplier, you know, would always overshadow the flat rate to an extent of adding attributes. But that's because I got mixed up in my head and I thought the damage die was always 3 damage, even though that's always on particularly successful successes. So a single d6 being multiplied might not be as good as having a certain flat amount added. That's definitely the case. Or at least the difference is not nearly even at upper ranges, not nearly as dramatic as what I was thinking, now that I've remembered that it's usually only 1 damage die. Alright. So pretty soon... Yeah, the thing I really wanted to check was features. Because it's going to be important to see what those actually do so I can determine what training and stuff does. Yeah, it's on like page 68. Okay, a lot of these seem to be confidence-based, whereas other of them do have a bit more of a dramatic effect. So I've seen a bit more about features. I wanted to go back on character creation now. So you get 2 features that you just pick, it looks like, because later it said, yeah. Talents and features are complex to get for more information about them. Chapter 7. So it's not really since it's +5 talents and +5 features rather than +5 talent or feature points, I think it's safe to assume that each talent and or feature does cost 1. And I don't think you really need to specify that. I just wanted to make sure I was on the same page about that. Right, so I was thinking for sources and features, I think, like, looking back at my past feedback, the reason that was specified for not having talent pools tied to source, and in the past, the naming convention was a little awkward because your source could, if I'm remembering right, your source could be like magic, and then there would be a talent pool called magic, but you wouldn't get access to it from that source. Like magical powers. Okay. But we're already into... Yeah, to me it is still, aside from me just not liking that your source isn't tied to talent pools, it's just a lot of dissonance for me that you could, have magic and then not automatically have that talent pool unlocked even. Like, just going for the response to my feedback, I think was maybe understood because I misunderstood, because I had suggested that you automatically unlock a talent set based on your source, depending on the source, and you don't have to spend the 1 point to unlock that set. But this kind of makes it seem like the creator didn't want that, so that people could have talent sets that are not obviously tied to their source. But the issue with that to me is that giving you a automatic set would not make it harder for you to select other sets as well. It would just give you a leg up in that set, which I think would make sense, but maybe that's just me. You can also question the idea generally of having separate sources and talent sets at all, and maybe just collect sources in the way that you would collect talent sets, since the source really only seems to just give you access to a feature, which you can get through character creation anyway. I'm sort of struggling to see the point of the source for anything other than flavor, which isn't really a problem. Flavor is nice, but for it having its own section in character creation, I would want the source to have a little more weight than it does currently. It's not that an unusual thing necessarily. Like, there are plenty of systems where, say, background does very little in the end. Just to re-look over it, I already looked at some of the stuff features did. I'm gonna probably not create a full character, but just look at some of the basics of character creation. Say I'm creating a tier 1 hero. Got 5 attribute points. I'll ignore those until I've figured out what talents I want, because that seems like a good idea. Features, probably first thing I'd pick would be source, because I'd want my abilities to sort of go in line with that. Otherwise, what's the point of having a source? Okay, let's see. I'm kind of curious what bonded item does. That would give you an iconic item. That's interesting. Seems a little pointless since there are so many other ways to deal with being at 0 health, though. And you can't be at lower than 0 health, I think that's already established. Ah, but you can repair it. Yeah, and I would say that does not at all, to me, indicate what I would think an iconic item would be, even based on its description. Like, looking at this, you're expecting, like, Thor's hammer or something, or some sort of symbiote thing, and in the end, all it does, instead of you never being able to lose it, or you being able to summon it to you, or you using powers with it, or anything like that, all it is you can sacrifice it to gain 1 health. And that's sort of a letdown to me in terms of the applications of that, but I already thought I wasn't going to be that impressed with the sources. Let's look at training. Let's see. There's not really like an orphan background, which you maybe would expect. Oh, that's training. Yeah, so I don't know what that would be for training. Trying to think what would be fun to have an iconic item with. Because it's sort of the first thing that comes to mind. Well, I was thinking... Yeah, inheriting money doesn't really make you an entrepreneur, I'm fairly certain. I don't really know exactly the term, though. I suppose you would have started businesses from the ground up at some point if you have all the money to do so anyway, but I still don't know if that counts for the term. But it's not like it matters that much, because it's sort of the first thing I thought of. The object will be an inheritance of some kind. And yeah, that's why I'm going with entrepreneur. And then there's contact businessman and wealthy. Okay, we'll go back to contact. Uh-oh. There we go. So does that mean you have to have the contact feature multiple times to do this? Or you just have to name a different person when using this feature that you make up? That's not really clear to me. That seems very, very good. Probably too good, in fact. Yeah, so the features do seem sort of vastly unbalanced to me. Where are we now? But I've got iconic, wealth, weapon, wealthy, and contact. What's next? Next I was going to go with, like I said, I'm not really going through the full process like name or anything, I'm just trying to focus on the mechanical aspects. Next that I would want to do would probably be talents, though I could maybe should look at features since I've already looked at them in a sense. What else would make sense for my guy? Okay, there we go. Okay, Black Musketeer makes sense. Because I can do a lot of stuff with contacts and buying anything and knowing how to buy specific stuff. I want to try and get something else related to my iconic item because, you know, that seems to be the key to my character, but I'm not really sure what to do with it so far. I'm probably not taking that one. I could say that that is how my item transforms me, but that isn't really great. I'll say supernatural senses. Maybe it's a pair of magic eyeglasses or something. So, I have thought of something in line with the way I think this is supposed to work. The talents are often supposed to come from the source. The creator just didn't want to tie specific talents to certain sources so that you could reflavor things easily, but I think another way to do that is for, say, my character. He gets his talents when he has his iconic item with him, and if he loses that item, he loses the talents, and that makes that more, you know, key. That makes it more, what do you call it? Yeah, that ties things together without being super restrictive. And you could sort of theme it as each source having an area where they're particularly strong. Like, if it's something that I can use my item for in some way and the GM agrees, I can get whatever the advantage state in this is called based on that, and it has a weakness where something deactivates it and makes it so you can't use your talents. Like for Superman, that would say be kryptonite. For my character, that would be losing the iconic item, even if it's only temporarily. And maybe there would be some suggestions on how my character could find it based on his source and stuff. The question with that is that you're supposed to have multiple sources, but I would say a player can just choose, if they have multiple sources, which source the talent is tied to. And I think that's a little bit better of a way of making the source still seem like it matters while having it connected to whatever talents you want. But, you know, that's just an idea. You obviously can take it or leave it. So I've decided my features more or less. Let's see if I even remember them. I've got the iconic item. I've got wealthy and contact, and then I picked black market and magical senses. Feeling vaguely Artemis Fowl-ish at this point. What else am I looking for? Right. Now I think I'm on to talents. I could go back to character creation to double check, but I'll just look at it. Adapted body doesn't really fit. Climb, not really. Deflecting strength, nah. Maybe that, but I don't quite feel like it. And I'm gonna ignore attributes for now. Evasive reflexes doesn't really feel like it fits this theme. Extra appendages doesn't really feel like it fits the theme. I suppose you could also have talents be tied to training too. And you can pick what you get from what. Not really this one. Keen senses fits the theme. Right, so I would take keen senses, that's 1 out of 5. Say his item also makes him vaguely magical, so he has a nexus connection too, that's 2. Let me actually pay attention to what these do. Right, so that seems, just advantages on Nexus stuff, that's nice. Advantages to notice things, that fits well with other stuff I have. I think I could go for regeneration based on the item, maybe. I think I like this one better, though. You gain energy DR1. I don't know if... Oh, that's a prerequisite of tier 2 anyway. I was gonna say, I don't know if that is really any different from increasing the stat. I'd have to look up how energy DR works to figure that out. X-ray vision is another sight one, so I suppose that works. So far I had Nexus and Keen Senses. So I'd go for X-ray vision 2. Now all of these would require buy-in, so I could only get one of them. Yeah, I don't think it controls elements much. So I don't know what command actions are. Does that mean leadership talents, or does it mean something else? A lot of these are tier 2, it looks like. Alright, and just for the sake of brevity, I'll pick this. So it looks like it's basically just a normal range 3 attack that uses empathy. And you do it to energy. And it can have a status effect, so that's fairly interesting. And I know that that means I'll be increasing my empathy at least somewhat. I didn't really think of him as an empathetic character, though, but at this point may as well just go with it. Alright, so I need to look at what the attributes are. How much I can allocate. So right off the bat, I'm just going to put 4 in empathy. Then the next thing I need to think about is how to actually attack. Because I think that's generally going to be either strength or maybe reflexes it was. I wasn't paying too much attention, but I feel like a lot of my characters' moves didn't cost energy, so I don't have to focus too much on that, but I won't take away from it either. Gonna go -2 on strength. -1 on tenacity, may as well. And then put 4 in reflexes, because I assume that's the ranged attacking stat, I can't remember. I feel like from doing that, I don't really have a particularly greater understanding of how my character would look. I'm trying to look what reflexes were defined again. I have to double check that I understand how attack work. I'm not finding it at this point. I'm looking for like a heading that's reflexes, but I'm already down the way in talents. Like here, it would be nice to have it be easy to tell when the features are actually defined. I know it's in a couple places, but the attribute scores, I mean, okay, here we go. Okay, they're not defined here. Let's see attacks. Yeah, so it does not say what an attack check is against there. I know I read it somewhere, but I can't remember now. Okay, attribute scores, yeah. But where are they defined? I could have sworn they were in there somewhere earlier, but I really can't find it. Okay, where's the making and attack section? Because there really needs to be a making and attack section. I'm not seeing it. Okay, maybe attack will be defined in more detail here. Okay, so it's against the defense. And range is definitely reflex, I figured out, so. If I had a +4 to reflex, I would get up to 10 as a value. Is their defense just their stat? So I'm guessing it's just like the defense is just the stat. Defenses of a character's running score. Oh no, right, it's 3d6, so average would say be like 13. And then defenses, I think if I remember right, is 10 plus the stat. I was ignoring that because I didn't think there was any way, but then I realized I was thinking of 1 die instead of 3. But defense would say be 13 for something with a defense of 3, and I would be able to hit that on average with my reflexes. Not really sure what kind of weapon my character would use, but that all seems fair. So I looked through it all. Other than not defining what a success versus a failure is, I would say there are no super major issues. But I feel like a lot of the book is really missing superhero theming that immerses you in the desired setting and vibe, sort of. Like, I'm sure there are some in the features, but that's way too late to get started on that. The shoving people through a wall thing, that definitely had the theming, but it didn't really have the flavor of feeling like you're reading something classic superheroes related in the language even then. And it's been pretty absent everywhere else, and that's, like, not a major flaw, but you're not really selling your system very well if you don't make the reader feel in the mood of sort of classic superheroes while reading the rules. And that's probably something to think about more down the line. It's not as important early on as getting down the mechanics and stuff, but it's something to think about. Yeah, and the other problem I have, which might just be me, is I don't really like the way Source works. I don't feel like how you're supposed to tie it to talents flavor-wise is very well established. And I think something mechanically tying it to the talents you select would help reinforce that, as well as simply stating it more explicitly in the rules. Like the idea I mentioned, I think could work. Now, you'd obviously want to mess around with it a little to see what version works best, but I definitely think having talents tied to source and then to just make it as simple as possible. You can obviously do other things, but just as simple as possible. That source has a weakness which makes you lose those powers, in certain circumstances. I think that about covers it. Like, a lot of the stuff, to really know how good this is overall, I'd really have to do a deep dive in the talents, but it seems very functional, and it definitely seems like you can set up some fun characters with it.